we now have the meeting with an adventure that crossed geographically boundaries. In the session titled Around the Word Adventure, we host Tracey Curtis Tyler. He will narrate to us the details of her daring journeys and the challenges of flying across the end of the earth. Miss Tracey, we ask you to proceed to the stage to show us how big the world is and full of adventure that we can discover and learn from.
Perfect. Testing, can you hear me? Bravo. It is the most wonderful pleasure and a great honor as well. So my personal thanks to His Royal Highness, Prince Sultan. I have actually been here before, so it's rather wonderful to be back at Al Thamama. I first came through in 2016, flying my 1942 Boeing Stearman, which is an antique aeroplane, obviously, but I was actually on a flight from England to Australia, following a very famous female pilot, Amy Johnson. So it's wonderful to be back. I had the most marvelous time in Saudi Arabia. We came in through Al Jarf and then Hail into Al Thamama, where Prince Sultan hosted us here with the Saudi Aero Club. And then we flew out onto the Dubai Air Show and then on across the Gulf to Pakistan, onto India, etc., and onto Australia. So it's wonderful to be back. But this was several expeditions that I did, 3 expeditions following famous flights by female pilots in the 1920s and early 1930s. The first flight was from Cape Town in South Africa back to England, a 10,000-mile flight which took us 2 months. Although I was following famous solo flights, mine was a supported flight with a support aircraft, and of course with engineering help, and we also had a film crew on board because we were making a documentary film about the story and history. So the first flight from Africa, 10,000 miles, 38 stops. The second flight was from England to Australia. That took us 3 months to do. That was 62 stops through 23 countries, 3 months. And then finally, when I got to Sydney in Australia, I shipped my Stearman from Sydney to Seattle and flew the US transcontinental. So it was 3 major expeditions. So look, with that start, can we cue the teaser just to give you an idea of some of the flying? I'm Tracey Curtis Taylor. Ever since a 20-minute flying lesson, age 16 in Canada, I've devoted myself to flying vintage biplanes.
She's an absolutely terrific pilot. She's almost unique in the world in flying open cockpit biplanes and flying such long distances.
So that moment when I first got into an old open cockpit aeroplane, you're out in the elements, I just thought, this is the only kind of flying I want to do. Not just flying, but recreating the epic flights of the often forgotten female trailblazers who lit up the interwar skies of Europe and America. In 2013, flying my 1940s Boeing Stearman, I set off to recreate Lady Mary Heath's record-setting flight from Cape Town to London in 1928.
She sort of takes you back to the old days of aviation. This is stick and rudder. This is how flying was in the early 20s and 30s.
These trips were quite remarkable. Flying these airplanes is a very special thing. It's the passion for aviation and adventure.
In 2015, I decided to go one further, and that was to commemorate and celebrate probably the single finest flight ever performed by a female pilot. I'm flying my aeroplane, really in celebration of a first woman to fly solo from the UK to Australia, and her name was Amy Johnson.
The inspiration for my flights comes from these early pioneers.
She basically crashed her way to
These were some of the most brilliant female role models of the 20th century. Where is their legacy? Why are they not being taught in schools? Why aren't they known today?
Only 5% of commercial pilots are women.
Has anybody flown? Has anybody been in an aeroplane before?
One of my aims in recreating these early flights is to ignite the same passion for flying that drove these early birds into the air.
We're getting the story out there and engaging with young people, particularly girls. I was telling them what these astonishing women had achieved and how the message is still relevant today. But I was also telling them my story, you know, how this was my life's work, how I got this dream machine, my Boeing Stearman, and how I was taking this around the world as a flagship for this historic female achievement.
In Saudi Arabia, I met Princess Rima Al Saud, a champion of women's rights, health and well-being in a country with the highest prevalence of breast cancer in the world.
Get the girls flying.
I was made an ambassador of her charity and carried their logo, Wings of Hope, on my Boeing Stearman for the rest of the trip. In 1930, Amy Johnson's route to Australia took her through what is now Pakistan. The highlight of my flight to Australia was in Karachi at the Darwood Foundation School.
There are 2,000 girls there from the age of 5 to 16. Some of them were dressed as airline pilots. They had Blériot moustaches on. They had biplanes stuck to their heads. They presented me with a papier-mâché model of the Stearman, an armful of flowers and cards. I was amazed how many of them said, yes, I want to be a pilot. I mean, it's not easy to do it. The cost, the access, you know, some of the social restrictions that these girls are up against, and yet they shared it. I could feel their excitement about it. The ethos of my flight is to celebrate what women have achieved in history and what they will achieve going forward. In 2016, I took my Stearman to America to fly the historic airmail route from West Coast to East Coast. In that interwar period, that golden age of aviation, more women were flying in America than anywhere else on the planet.
This flight is a homecoming of sorts for my beloved Boeing Stearman. It was built in Wichita in 1942 and reconditioned in Austria-Hungary in 2012.
The Boeing Stearman, for me, captures the golden age of aviation, the iconic biplane.
We did, of course, some modifications on the airplane to give her the range she needs, some navigation equipment, etc. It's a modified propeller. It's one of the most beautiful Stearman restorations I ever did, and I personally fell in love with the airplane as well.
You know, people ask me why I do it, but if they could just sit with me in that cockpit, flying low level through deserts and low over coastlines and over jungles, they would understand. There's the dream and there's the dreamers. And the pioneers shared the dream when it was still so fresh. And you get a sense of how those pioneers would have felt, seeing something like that for the first time.
My flights are the culmination of my own life as an aviator, but I hope this will be the beginning for the next generation. That just gives you some idea of the scale of this. So 10,000 miles up Africa and 14,500 miles to Australia. So, you know, just to wind the clock back, I did not come from an aviation family. By virtue of being a female, I couldn't join the Air Cadets at school. I couldn't join the military because the RAF were not recruiting female pilots back in the 1980s. That took until 1990 in Britain before they started recruiting females. At school, I had no career advice whatsoever. I was raised in a small farming town in the north of England, so I had no access to aviation whatsoever, and I couldn't have afforded to, what's more. But I actually moved to New Zealand in the early 1980s. I have a twin sister, and I followed her to New Zealand, and that's really where I started to learn to fly. I'd had a lesson at 16, but it was only in my early 20s that I could, when I was working, that I could afford to fly. So I basically waitressed my way through a private and a commercial license, and then I started instructing. But my real passion was actually flying these old aeroplanes, and I'm sure it actually came from watching that film, Those Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines. If you've never seen it, I suggest you watch it, because it's still my favorite film. But it's all about the early days of aviation back before World War I. And it's just this wonderful, romantic, wild adventure when aviation represented a kind of idealism and a kind of wonderful new technology. The pioneers that I were following, I mean, obviously aviation became heavily militarized very early on, and this is one of the reasons why it was so hostile to women. It was a male establishment, and they didn't want women flying, and that went on for most of the 20th century. But the period that really interested me was the interwar period. So we had the epic solo flights, as they were really establishing the early air routes that became the mass air travel of today. So we had Charles Lindbergh flying the Atlantic in 1927, and that electrified the world. So suddenly the whole world was just inflamed with the idea of flight, and that's the point where these wonderful trailblazing women entered history. So we had Lady Heath flying up Africa, the first person to fly solo from Cape Town back to England, Amy Johnson, the first woman flying solo to Australia, and of course Amelia Earhart, who was the first woman to fly across America. So that's who I was following in my flights. But my own flying, it was just the old stuff. So I never went the conventional route. I never became an airline pilot. I worked in aerial photography and mapping for several years, but it was really my passion for flying these old airplanes. The Stearman, as you can see, is the love of my life. It's a dream machine. It's a 1942. These were military trainers in World War II, and Boeing made over 10,000 of them. So it's a very basic airplane to fly. I have no real instrumentation. There's no glass cockpit in that. This is stick and rudder, foot and hand control. It's all visual flying. I've got no instrumentation, so it's all visual flying, although I do obviously have a little Garmin and a GPS, an iPad for the airspace. Having decided to fly Africa back in 2009, and this gestated for 25 years. I was always mad about Africa, and I wanted to fly it in an open cockpit biplane, having seen the film Out of Africa, which had this wonderful romantic flight over the Ngong Hills. It won all the Oscars back in 1985. And when I saw that film, I thought, that's exactly how I want my life to be. 25 years later, I flew Africa. So having decided to do it, it took me 4 years to pull that expedition together. So getting the airplane to fly it, I had the Stearman restored. I had to make the baggage compartment slightly bigger because, of course, there was a lot of Estee Lauder and Clarins on board, and I go everywhere with a hairdryer. When you're doing open cockpit flying, every day is a bad hair day, I can tell you. So it took 4 years to pull that together, to build the sponsorship behind it. Boeing came on board fabulously as my first sponsor, because of course it was a Boeing Stearman. And off the back of that, I then got a fund manager in London who was my biggest principal sponsor. And in every country I flew through, I had an industrial partner there who would help us. Singapore Airlines, the Taj Group in India, and so on. So that's how I built the flight. And with the help of Boeing and the British government, we built an outreach campaign across the world, really celebrating this historic achievement of women in aviation, which is so underrated and undervalued. And of course, when you think of now the challenge that faces the world, there is a huge pilot and engineering shortage in the industry. And unless we recruit more young women into aviation and aerospace, a lot of countries cannot even crew their military aircraft, let alone their civilian airliners. So my flights were really a big communications campaign to get to the women in schools, to get to the young people, and to say this is the most wonderful opportunity. When I look at the sort of life that I've had, I never understood, but aviation, in fact, was the key to it. So looking back in history, some of the things these women were up against. I mean, obviously, they didn't have things like the kind of GPS mapping that we have access to. They didn't have the weather reports, but nor did they also were flying without radios, etc., which I think on the whole is probably a good thing. But just to compare then with now, so to take an aeroplane like this, I mean, I've flown this now nearly 40,000 miles through 39 countries. So some of the biggest challenges there. When Amy famously, she said back in 1930 when she was flying to Australia, she basically crashed her way. She crashed about 4 times. And everywhere she went, she said it didn't matter where I landed, whether it was in the desert in Iraq or on some remote tropical island through Indonesia. She said, I only had to wait about 10 minutes and an Englishman in a pith helmet would appear. Fat chance of that in the 21st century. So you're on your own with an aeroplane like this. You have to carry absolutely everything with you. So we had often barrels of fuel in the chase plane. We had to carry the oil, the tooling, spare parts, etc., and of course a fairly extensive wardrobe for the pilot. So that was just some of the issues, and of course they didn't have to contend with all the bureaucracy and procedure and all the air traffic control, and that was actually one of the most challenging aspects for me. Just briefly, because I know we're up against, I don't know, are we up against time? Are we okay? Well, just some of the things that I was up against, yeah, with the air traffic control, and it's true, they will have a good go at killing you, air traffic controllers, as pilots. But in Africa, one of the first incidents was actually flying over Victoria Falls in Zambia. And of course, it's one of the great natural scenes in the world. And I thought, wow, I really want to get low over the falls. But of course, often the traffic is stacked up to 10,000 feet with all the tourist operations and helicopters. And, you know, I thought I'd be way up, you know, I'd be too high to really get a decent view of it. But one of the local pilots has said, if you fly in at lunchtime, and this was off-season, you should be all right. There'll be nobody around. So sure enough, I'm barreling up the Zambezi River, and I could see the sort of, it's canyon land, so it looks flat. And all you can see is a sort of puff of smoke on the horizon, that's Victoria Falls, and it's the water vapor thrown up by the fall. So I came in, time check, 12:15. I thought, brilliant, right on time. Nobody in sight, just a couple of buzzards flying over. And I flew over at about 150 feet, just about in the foam, just flying over it, fantastic view. 10 minutes later, I came in to land at Livingston Airport, and I immediately had an air traffic problem. They said, no, you should be at 4,000 feet. I was at 2,000 feet, maybe 800 feet above the ground. And they wanted me to climb to 4,000 feet. And I said, no, I'm in an old aeroplane. It's 50 degrees Celsius outside. I said, it's very difficult for me to climb. I've got visual with the runway, request a straight-in approach, which they gave me. But of course, as I was rolling down the runway, the very thing a pilot doesn't want to hear, contact the tower. So I parked up, call in at the tower, and there was the head controller. And he was absolutely horrified that I had entered the airspace. I didn't actually know what the procedures were, and I didn't actually have a map for it. So I had to sort of make this kind of groveling apology, and I said, look, I'm so sorry, you know. But he looked at me and he said, this sort of thing might be all very well in Britain, but here in Zambia, we have health and safety. A slightly more menacing incident was actually in Uganda, and I was on approach into Entebbe Airport. Now, remember, I'm slow in this aeroplane. I'm coming in on approach, and I've got about 2 miles to run, and suddenly the air traffic controller says, please go around, you've got an airliner coming up fast behind you. So I'm thinking, wow, okay. So I did a wide left-hand orbit around the airfield, and as I'm flying this, I happen to look down, and there's this absolutely magnificent Palladian mansion below me. So I have a good look as I'm going around, came into land. Sure enough, I'm on the runway, contact the tower. I thought, oh, here we go again. This time, I was actually met by the military police and practically frog-marched up to the tower. It transpired that I had flown through a restricted area, and that was the presidential palace. So he sits me down, and the next minute he hands me a brochure marked top secret, and there's a picture of 9/11, the airliners flying into the World Trade Center. So he hands me that, and I looked at this, And I just thought, what? And then the penny dropped. I just looked at him and I said, so do you actually think that I represent some sort of security issue, you know, some sort of national threat to Uganda's security, because I've inadvertently flown this? I said, look, I said, have you seen my aeroplane? I said, it's a wood and fabric biplane. If I screwed up the landing, I might take a fence out if I'm lucky. I said, but I don't think I constitute a threat to the president. I said, and if you want to make this a diplomatic incident, I think this could get embarrassing. And I said, you know, back in 1928, when Lady Heath flew through Uganda, I said she had the most marvelous time while she was here. It would be a great pity if I couldn't report the same in 2013. But, you know, he kept me there for 2 hours, and they were threatening to impound the aeroplane. And that's when you get this sense, my God, these people, they can do anything that they want. They can just put you in prison, and that was that. But he did actually let me go. So that was just some of the things that you're up against now. Of course, the biggest single thing is always the weather. In something like this, you're open cockpit, you're exposed to the elements, and you're slow. And a few times just getting caught out, particularly coming through winter systems in Europe, flying that aeroplane on the deck through fog, heavy rain, absolutely at tree level, and thinking, what am I doing? I mean, I was absolutely petrified, but we made it. So I have to say, looking back, I don't think I'll ever do anything finer in my whole life. But the challenge now is to get more young people, particularly women, into this wonderful, wonderful industry. I tell you what, we're going to wrap up with one thing. We did a little clip of some of the footage filming around Saudi Arabia here, right here in Riyadh. Do you have the last clip that we can pull up? This was just some of the footage, if they can find it. Abdul, do you have the final clip, the one of just the Saudi? No? Okay, we've lost it. I just wanted to show you some of the desert flying, which looked like sequences out of The English Patient. But this was some of the loveliest flying I did here. This is called the edge of the world, this rim here. And, you know, it felt like it, flying it. I thought, you know, flying that about 30 feet off the sand with the sun blazing off my wings, and it was like flying into infinity. So this thing moving in 3 dimensions, this was like being in that 4th dimension. This was like a metaphysical side to flying. So I'll never do anything finer in my life. And I look forward to coming back to Al Thamama next time with the Stearman. So look, thank you very much. I do have a book too. So we did a couple of documentaries. I'm trying to get the 2nd documentary broadcast now. This was the book I wrote, Bird. I do have a few copies with me, which I'd like to give out. The ladies, if you'd like to come, I'd love to give you a signed copy of that. But thank you very much again.
Yeah.
Oh, it looks slightly unreal when I watch it, and I've seen it so many times I get a bit bored watching it. It's nothing like being in the aeroplane itself, where you've got the roar of that engine and just the exhilaration. It's hard to convey how exciting and beautiful it is to fly an aeroplane like that, low level, through some of the most dramatic, hostile terrain in the world. So it was fantastic, wonderful.
Any question?
Yeah. Which
Is it, where can we see that?
you know, the first one was a film. It was called The Aviatrix, The Lady Who Flew Africa, which was about Lady Heath. Now that was the BBC screen that, and that should be on YouTube. But I do have some DVDs of that.
Okay, where can we get them?
Come and talk to me later. All right, I'll try and link you through my website.
Thank you very much.
Someone have the question.
Books you're giving to the ladies. You said you'll give some
Sarah?
books to the ladies. Yeah.
Someone have.
I think I've overrun, but thank you. Okay, Jeffrey, that's your cue.